Readers, listeners, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in literature. I am really excited today to dive into Kaveh Akbar's MARTYR. This is a very specific lecture today. This is part 2. If you're interested in a lecture that talks more broadly about MARTYR, which is just an absolutely incredible book, which deserves an enormous amount of exploration, you're going to want to listen to the other lecture first. This lecture today is going to talk very specifically about the ending of the novel. So I myself finished this book and did that thing where I was like, oh no, it's like one of these ambiguous endings where I don't really know what happened. In fact, I really wanted, I think with a lot of people, a happy ending for Cyrus. And I really was convinced that we were moving in that direction. So I did a little bit of extra reading myself. I went back and looked at a few things. And then in order to really develop my own thesis about the whole thing. And then I went online and did that thing that I do often with movies where I'm like, explain ending MARTYR Kaveh Akbar. And in fact, there are a couple of different reviews. There's one woman, Katie Waldman in the New Yorker, essentially says, in fact, that at the end of the book, that Cyrus ascends to heaven, which I was like, wow, that seems like a bold assertion on her part. Everyone else that I read in terms of the reviews and all of the interviews that I heard Kaveh Akbar give, everybody sort of studiously is not talking about the end of the book. But Katie Waldman just went for it. On Reddit and on a number of different, personal blog kind of, book website type things, people have made a lot of conjecture. There was a long subreddit about, how this book ended. It did that cool thing, which I'm always so impressed with this, where when there's spoilers, it's all like blacked out, like redacted. And then when you click on them, the text becomes apparent to you. So I was reading through a bunch of different theories, and some of them mapped onto what I was thinking, and some of them did not. Some of them, in fact, were working against some of the data that I had collected. So what I want to do today is to take a close look at the ending, and I'm going to lean a little bit toward the happy ending because that is what I want, but I'm also going to present all of the data that I can imagine, not all of the data, but some of the data that I think does, in fact, argue for the more bleak and more difficult ending. So the kind of big bombshell here is that I think that Kaveh Akbar has done this incredible thing where you can read both endings. I really think it is so open-ended, and there are so many different ways that argue for both endings that really you can have the ending you want. It's not like a choose your own adventure story. It's not quite like that. But I think if you amass, there's so many details and so many really important things that you are meant to be gathering, lots of breadcrumbs and little hints here and there. There's so many different things that on the first reading, if you're only going to read this book once, you're going to come away having retained certain of these breadcrumbs and not retained others of them. I'm sort of convinced that, if you want to see the one thing, you're going to see that. If you want to see the other, you're going to see that. If you want a happy ending, you're going to remember certain elements. And if you want, in fact, to believe that he kills himself, you're going to remember certain other elements from the past of the book. But what we're going to do today, after we look at some of those first elements, is look very closely at the end of the novel in order to really check out the data, check out what it is that Kaveh Akbar is actually saying toward the end of the book. And I think in many ways how he is inviting us to really interpret this in both ways, which is such an incredible gift. I mean, in some ways I'm incredibly frustrated and I really want to just ask him and have him tell me what he thinks. But I really honestly believe after quite a bit of, sleuthing and quite a bit of thinking and rereading, my sense is that he really is trying to allow the reader to make her own decision and that there's ample proof to prove either one of these theses. So we're going to dive in. I think the way that this is going to happen is that I'm going to give different pieces of information that I think are either pointing in both directions or are pointing in one or the other. And then I'm going to sort of on the fly here, I may have to kind of, pick them apart. Or who knows, maybe by the end of this, I'll have a different interpretation. So if you want to argue for death, if you want to argue for the fact that at the end, what is happening is Cyrus is rising into heaven, there is ample evidence for that. So a couple of things that are very obvious, or not like that obvious, but like if you stop and think about this a little bit, you will come up with all of these same points. One is that the novel begins with this hospital job that he has where he is pretending to be someone who is very sick, if not dying. So we have him in these conversations where a doctor is saying to him, "You're dying," and he's sort of like dealing with this information. So the fact that he is a hospital actor who is enacting the death of different people over and over and over is, in fact, I think, an argument for him dying. But I also think that you could argue that he is going to sort of move through many deaths in this book, and he has talked about recovery as sort of like, you can have, well, this is another idea that's not exactly his, but the idea that there are many times when you are in the throes of addiction where you should have died, and this is not like always the case, but for people who have substance abuse disorder, you have all of these different times where you sort of barely survive. So you have this sense of having sort of, living on borrowed time a bit, just because you have in fact suffered through something that was very difficult. So I think there is an argument that there are these many deaths that either point toward the idea that he is dying at the end, or point to this idea that he is moving through death and is sort of surmounting it each time. So in the beginning, this job of working in the hospital as someone who is dying, acting it out, is, I think that's pretty compelling evidence for the fact that he is going to die. We then have his actual suicide attempt. So he talks in the beginning about the suicide attempt that he makes, where he covered himself in alcohol and then was going to light himself on fire, which is a very martyry thing to do. In fact, just recently we have had citizens light themselves on fire in protest of different things that are happening in the world. So this kind of very martyry suicide attempt is something that he's kind of trying in the beginning of the book. But again, so I think that could lead you toward, if you wanted to believe it, it could lead you toward the idea that that was sort of a, dress rehearsal for his eventual suicide or his death at the end of the book. But in fact, I think you can also argue that he does not, in fact, commit suicide. He realizes that if he, catches on fire, that the whole building might catch on fire. And then he goes outside and he still doesn't do it. So he is thinking of other people. He's thinking outside himself. And he considers suicide and, in fact, does not do it. So this is another example of where we have literary data from the book that can point in different directions, that he surmounts the urge to commit suicide, but he also, we're not supposed to say commit suicide anymore, to perform suicide, but in fact does not do that. But in fact, sort of surmounts the idea. We also have this idea that when he is staying in the hotel and he wets the bed, he says he pisses himself. When he pisses himself in the hotel room, he hasn't been drinking the night before. There's some speculation. And I don't really agree with this, but this is one of the things that people are speculating about. He claims at that point, when he wakes up, in the wet bed, that there wasn't drinking involved in the night before. But I think there could be an argument that perhaps there was some sort of, overdose or some sort of relapse that occurred at that point. That is not a theory that I think has a lot of evidence, but I do think it's an interesting point. There's also an infantilization that is going on. This is a different point. But this idea of wetting the bed when he's not drinking, you can imagine that he's sort of regressing because he is going to visit this woman, Orchidee, who in fact turns out to be his mother. There's also this, I can spoil things now because we've all finished the book. But there's also that period too, or that moment too, when he wakes up with Z's thumb in his mouth. And it's, again, this very infantilizing thing. There's this idea of returning to the womb, of being in the bed, this idea of regressing, again, to childhood in order to go and meet with his mother. So I think the bedwetting can be explained by this regression to childhood. That, to me, makes more sense than the idea of him having overdosed. So the other thing that someone on the subreddit was pointing to, a couple of people thought this, when he is leaving the hotel and the guy says, did you make any art? And he says, no, not yet. A lot of people were pointing to that as this sort of, that maybe at that point he is dead and he's sort of like leaving the hotel, not having made any art because in fact he has committed suicide there. I'm not so ready to subscribe to that idea. My sense is that when he leaves the hotel and they ask if he's made any art and he hasn't yet, that is essentially that art is to come. Then, of course, we have the incident when he faints in the museum, which is another kind of death. Some people, I think, were reading that as some sort of a death. I did not. Again, I saw this as kind of a dark night of the soul, or as another time when he engages in something that seems like dying, but in fact, he emerges, not stronger, but he emerges having surmounted death, having sort of survived the temptation. It's interesting there to me that that it is someone from the Middle East. I think his name is Prakit, is the like security guy who offers him the Snickers and the banana, I think. So there's this idea of having been nurtured, in fact, by someone who is familiar, someone who he has gotten to know, someone who is taking care of him, and that person is, in fact, someone who is from the Middle East. So I am not a huge fan of the idea that when he fainted in the museum, that somehow that was emblematic of his death or his suicide. There was one person who was conjecturing, actually a couple of people, that in fact he dies of hypothermia when he is out in the cold when he leaves the museum. That is another theory that I'm not fully ready to ascribe to, and we're going to get into the reasons why when we read this through. So there are a bunch of different times when Cyrus is experiencing something that seems like death, and for a lot of people those were moments that sort of emblematic or foreshadowing of a type of death that occurs at the end of the novel. I would, in fact, argue that each of those are times when he is, in fact, emerging through a sort of death, that he is kind of working through. It's not like a dress rehearsal, maybe, but it's sort of these temptations towards something like death that he is able to resist. We're now going to get a little more specific and take a look at almost, a pretty close look here at pages 317 to 331. The ending of the novel. And as we move through, I'm going to make some different arguments. Daniel Mendelsohn says that in order to posit any interpretation and to really have it be meaningful, you need to have lots of data, and you can't have any data that contradicts your interpretation. I really believe in that, and I like the idea of approaching literature as a kind of science. It's not some sort of squishy thing. Well, I think it also can be that, especially with poetry, that there are lots of interpretations that are valid. But I think, people tend to get a little sloppy. And I think it is important to take a look at what the author is, in fact, offering us. So I'm going to make some interpretations here. And, of course, this is only my interpretation. And I have only read this book one time. I have not, in fact, gone back through and looked very carefully and exhaustively for all of the different breadcrumbs. But I have given this last part quite a bit of thought. So I lied. We're going to start on page 314. This is the last entry of the Book of Martyrs, .docx, by Cyrus Shams. It says this: I feel dangerous. I don't know how much more baldly I can say it. But how can an Iranian be dangerous without becoming a dangerous Iranian? Without becoming dangerous to every other Iranian in the world, or contributing to the myth of the pathologically angry Iranian, coming out of the womb with a burning flag in his teeth? Any volcano that has erupted since the Holocene, ancient history, is considered active. I haven't. Does that make me inert or overdue? This idea of being a volcano that is, in fact, dormant, that has not erupted yet. All of this is setting us up to really be paying close attention here, in this last chunk of the book, which is Cyrus's chunk. So I lied. We're going to start on page 315. So this is Monday. This is the fourth day in Brooklyn. So it begins with what I think is a very important sentence. After Sang left, making Cyrus promise to call her, making him promise he'd let her know when he got home to Indiana safely, Cyrus wandered around the park. The cold was invigorating, an anchor. So this idea in the very beginning of Sang as getting this promise that he will make it home safely, at the very end in the coda, we have Sang together with Roya, and they're together with Sang's oldest son. And in fact, she makes a sentence there about how they're happy because, in fact, her son, is with her and is safe. So if you recall, Sang had an alcoholic husband, and Sang herself was alcoholic, and Sang became sober, partially because she realized that her her children were in danger. So she escaped the husband, and she feels that she has provided safety for her boys. So the idea of that as being a kind of coda, I think, is a way that you could, in fact, argue for the fact that Cyrus is not, in fact, going to kill himself, that there is a measure of safety that she is getting from him. She's saying, make sure you're going to make it home safely. And then in the end, we have this vision of her with her son. Of course, you could also argue that this comes, that the coda part, the part at the very end with Sang and Roya and Sang's oldest son, comes in fact from before any of this happens with Orchidée. So you could imagine that the son there is, the survivor, and in fact that Cyrus doesn't. So again, any one of these interpretations can go both ways. So then we have him mentioning the article. The article is the obituary of Orchidée. He's looking at the image of her face, and he says this: Cyrus took a moment, a realization that this was an image, a text he would likely visit again and again for however much longer he'd remain alive. He still wasn't sure how long that'd be, and tried to slow himself down. So we have this idea here of him wanting to slow things down. And this to me sounds like he's really, he's considering whether or not he is going to kill himself. So this idea of he wasn't sure how long that would be, you have this sense that he is in control. But you can also, again, argue that he is going to stay alive. He talks about how he's going to see this image many, many times. And so that does, in fact, suggest that he's not, in fact, going to die right now. He is, in fact, going to keep seeing this image. So then he reads the obituary, and then when he finishes the article, we have this very important moment. So this is on 317. Finishing the article, Cyrus found himself praying, suddenly, without even realizing it. And then a little bit further down, what formed in Cyrus's mind was a blunt and inarticulate plea to be done, for reprieve from navigating what had become to him an unnavigable world, to not have to spend the next decade or decades unraveling what it all meant, had meant, would mean. The anger he felt at his mother, the vanished, the abandoner, but also the pride he felt for her now, the great artist. It was too much. He prayed for an end to the tyranny of all symbols, beginning with language. He understood with a clarity that had until that moment in his life eluded him that he was not at all made for the world in which he lived, that art and writing had gotten him only trivially closer to compensating for that fundamental defectiveness. The way standing on a roof gets one only trivially closer to grabbing the moon than standing in the dirt. Let me be done, he thought, this time in words, his mother's letters still glowing on the screen in his hands. He closed his eyes, said it out loud, let me be done. This is, to me, someone who is really ready to be done. I mean, he's really asking in a way that speaks to suicide, in my opinion. He just is tired of it. He's tired of language. He's tired of the symbols. He's tired of understanding. And this idea of let me be done really does, to me, sound like someone who wants to kill himself. So we have this idea. He speaks the words aloud. He's in words for him have a lot of power. So it's this prayer and it's this kind of incantation. And then his eyes are closed and he says the words, let me be done. And then we have this. When he opened his eyes, he was still alone on the park bench. So in my mind, he went through this thought pattern. He really seriously thought about it. And then he opens his eyes. He was still alone on the park bench. So he is not, he's, in my opinion, he has his eyes closed. He's considering suicide. And then he opens his eyes. It does say he's still alone, which is important. It's not that he was still on the park bench, because that would argue, I think, that he, in fact, is not going to kill himself. And it doesn't say he was alone on the park bench, because that would mean, that he's waiting for his mother or someone to appear. But the idea that he was still alone, he's still there and he's still alone, is very significant. The idea of opening his eyes at that point and still existing, to me, is one of the real arguments toward this happy ending that I'm hoping is going to happen. And then down at the bottom of that very paragraph, we have this. In his pocket, his phone was vibrating. He pulled it out, saw Z Novak was calling him. Quickly, he answered. Hey, Cyrus, Z said. I just got to the museum and saw... He paused, realizing Cyrus might not yet know. So this is a minor thing, but we are now in Z's brain. When he says at that point he realizes that Cyrus might not know, we have this incredible focusing. We have Z really coming into focus here. I think there's something to be said too with the fact that Z's name is Z. It's a longer name. He's Egyptian, but you have this sense of him as being like the last thing. It's like Alpha Omega. He is Z. He's the last part of the alphabet. He's the last thing that language has to offer up. And so you have this sense here of him as being kind of this ultimate thing. And to me, that speaks to the fact that he is in fact going to save Cyrus. So then he says about the museum, Z says this, "Have you been there yet?" "Yeah, I was there this morning," Cyrus said. "I'm sorry, man." Cyrus could hear plainly in Z's voice the pain that had inspired his exodus from their hotel, but also that pain was, in that moment, eclipsed by an acute concern for Cyrus, for the possibility Cyrus might do something rash in the wake of the artist's death. The clearness of it, of his friend's love and distress, suddenly felt pulverizingly obvious. How negligent Cyrus had been with Z's loyalty, with Z's devotion, cruel even. Sobriety meant Cyrus couldn't help but see himself eventually, and it hurt. He was repulsed by what he saw. "I'm so sorry too, Z, not for just last night. All of it, truly." So here, again, in my mind, this is him being saved by the fact that someone else has a concern for him, that he is not, in fact, only himself. I think all addicts would agree there's an incredible amount of sort of self-absorption. The only thing that is important is getting yourself high or drunk. So in this case, the idea of understanding that someone else really wants him to exist, that someone else is concerned, it becomes an incredibly important focus. And again, I would argue, for my happy ending, I would argue that Z is this kind of thing that brings Cyrus out of himself, and that Z's presence at the end of this book is arguing, in fact, for him to stay, for him to not, in fact, kill himself. So then on the next page, Cyrus is now waiting for Z to come and find him, which again is another argument in my mind. I mean, he and Z are getting together at the end, and they're physically together in the park. And I just don't really buy it that Z would somehow also be dying or also be committing suicide. I suppose people could argue that all of this is happening after his death, that this is a kind of heaven where he's going to go to the park and meet with Sang and then meet with Z. But to me, that seems hard to believe. Okay, so on 319, he's waiting for Z. He says this. Cyrus waited, and in his waiting became increasingly aware of how hot the ground had gotten under his feet. He could hear the humming, the vibrating, like the earth was very thin paper wrapped around a hornet's nest. Couple of very important things. So one thing is that Orchidea's voice gets to be like paper, and she is someone who is very powerful. We have not talked enough about her, but she is someone who is really ready to live for her art, really ready to devote herself to that. So the idea of hornets being inside paper, to me, seems sort of like we're thinking, at least in part, of her. But more importantly, we are thinking about the moment when Roya, who is also Orchidea, when Roya has her kiss with Layla. So when she has her kiss with Layla, when they're in the alley in Tehran, I think they're in Tehran, Layla asks if she can hear the angels under the earth, and they listen to the earth, and they hear the angels, and they hear this humming. So this is very similar here. And the kiss with Layla and the moment of the humming and hearing all of that, it's something that Roya doesn't quite understand yet, but she really wants that thing, and in fact is going to be in pursuit of it with Layla, and in fact has this decisive love affair that leads to her independence. So we have this idea of this humming as being a source of love. I mean, this is something that her love with Layla, that is when we hear this humming under the earth. So my sense here is that we now have Z and Cyrus together, and we have this idea of that same sort of humming really bringing them together. They're already together, but my sense is it's bringing them even further together. By the time he saw Z approaching in the distance, the ground felt like a great kiln firing something massive and delicate, sand into glass. So as Z is coming, the Earth is getting hotter. We also just, a second ago had this image of him as a volcano. So you have this sense of him as maybe erupting, and all of this, this vibration and this heat that is underneath the park where he is this idea of this volcano, and this idea of him as sort of, ready to explode with anger. So we have that kind of building as Z is coming over. At the sight of Z, Cyrus's heart caught in his chest with, he realized almost all at once, what must have been clarity. Clarity like he'd never known, sweet and unequivocal. The smell of walnut and wood smoke on the wind, the air felt thick. Somewhere in the distance, someone was singing. So this moment of clarity for me is this sense that someone who cares about him, which he hasn't really gotten that enough from his father, and certainly not from his mother, and certainly not from Orchidée, who's also his mother, for someone who hasn't gotten that, to finally understand that Z has been there, from even before he got sober, that Z is this person who really is the reason, he's not being neglected, which they get to in a minute. This is a reason, in fact, to live. Then down a little bit, Z smiled and made a show of jogging over to Cyrus, though he moved slowly to not slip on the ice in his ridiculous Crocs. So there's a moment of levity, which is so important. Cyrus gleamed, Z's woven backpack flopping up and down on his back in time with the bouncing of his curls. Cyrus loved him so much. I love you so much, Cyrus said, immediately following into a deep embrace as Z got to him. He used his thumbs to part the curls, crossing over Z's forehead, and kissed him there. So he's using his thumbs. We have seen his thumbs before with respect to Z as something that he woke with Z's thumb in his mouth. So you have this idea of him infantilized. He's sucking a thumb of someone, of Z, who is sort of like himself when they are together in this womb-like bed. And then here we have him using his thumbs to part the curls in order to sort of see this dear friend, this incredible partner more carefully, more clearly, with this clarity that he has already articulated. Then a little further, I'm so sorry. He meant it. Z's goodness filled him like a drug. So before, when he is with Orchidée, they're talking about what to fill this emptiness, that there's this story about how Satan realizes that Adam is empty, and in fact it's going to be so easy to corrupt him. And I think it's Orchidée who asks him what he thinks he is filled with, and he's not sure, but here it is Z's love that fills him. He says maybe art earlier, maybe writing, maybe beauty, but now in fact it is Z. It is also Z who is filling him like a drug. So this idea of seeking something in his sobriety and also in his addiction, seeking something that he hasn't been able to find. He hasn't been able to fill that void, and in fact it is Z that is filling that void. Hey, Z said, smiling, pulling his head back from Cyrus's. I love you too, you idiot. So I love that. I mean, there we, again, a little moment of levity. They kissed on the lips, a quick and firm kiss that seemed at once tiny and unbreakable, like a pebble. I saw a little echo of Beckett there. So in a lot of Beckett's work, there are a lot of pebbles in pockets and in mouths, and this idea of pebbles as being something that is small and indestructible. So I think we're having a literary echo here. It wasn't right how Cyrus had treated Z. His barb the night before, yes, but also their entire relationship, like he was entitled to his friend's adoration. How had he been so oblivious? Love was a room that appeared when you stepped into it. Cyrus understood that now and stepped. So here, again, you have this incredible metaphor of love being a room that appears when you step into it, and he's stepping into this love. I think, some people maybe on the subreddit would argue that this is a heaven, that he's stepping into a type of heaven. I would argue that because Z is this terrestrial figure, that he is in fact stepping into the love of Z. He is finally, it's sort of like it's the love of Z that is allowing him to be tethered to the earth and to stay tethered. Then on the next page, we have this beautiful sentence where he says, Cyrus was dizzy with it, this love, its abrupt and total overwhelm. And then a little bit further down, there's all around them, the city's skyline of desiccated towers blinked absently, some of them crumbling around their edges. The trees of Prospect Park had at some point shaken off the snow and erupted into bloom. Lavender buds, blue and yellow and crimson flowers Cyrus didn't recognize. "Are you seeing this?" asked Z, gesturing to the wilding world around them. So we have this blooming. So in the beginning, when we first hear Z might love Cyrus, it's springtime, and it's the very beginning of spring. And now we have this coming into bloom in a way that I think is meant to be an extension. It's meant to be the full blooming of this kind of incipient spring that Z is describing, in 2015. There's mention of lavender buds, and earlier, Orchidee / Roya talked about having a lavender sprig and being able to transport herself. So there are lots of echoes. There's probably lavender elsewhere in the book. So he says, "Are you seeing this?" said Z. "I am," Cyrus nodded. "I think it's maybe because of us." His words weren't moving quite in sync with his lips. "Of course you do," Z laughed. "You're not wrong, though." His hands were cupped in front of him on his lap. "You're not wrong." And then down a little bit lower, Cyrus felt lightheaded. His foot pulsed hard. So this is one of these times where I'm going to have to make a little argument. If you recall, he has this injury on his foot. He has this scar that is often pulsing. And the reason he got the scar is when he and Z, very early on in the book, are doing all of those weird chores for that weird guy. This is back before anybody has gotten sober. You have him and Z chopping wood, and he chops into his foot. And in fact, it is Z who takes him into the bathroom and nurses this wound. The reason I bring all of that up is that this wound is really playing a big role at the end here of the novel. It's pulsing with heat. It's pulsing with pain. It's something that has really stayed with him and is coming to the fore now. The reason why I think it is important is a couple of different things. One is that the idea of the axe that these boys are using to chop wood should be reminiscent for you of the axe that Arash carries when he is being the angel of death in the fields when all of the young Iranian men are dying. So you have this, there's a long description of this axe. And the axe, actually, there's Muhammad's axe is another mention at one point. And in Iranian art and in Persian mythology, not mythology, but their folklore, this axe is very important. So the idea of him having injured himself with the axe is really crucial. The reason why is because later in the book, relatively close to the end, we have this idea that civilization began with a mending, and it began with this broken femur. So the idea of the broken femur is that, if a femur of an ancient person had actually mended, what that meant is that someone else had taken care of them until they were healthy and they could survive. The opposite of that is that at one point on the battlefield, Arash sees a guy, a dying soldier, whose leg is sort of missing. His leg, his femur is sort of splayed open by some terrible war injury. So you have this idea of Arash as the angel of death, as seeing this broken femur of this person who is going to die. And then later we have this idea of mending, this idea of someone caring enough for another that allows them to survive. So my theory is that when we have this axe injury, and Z is the one who is mending and taking care of Cyrus back then, and frankly, Z is really taking care of Cyrus throughout their entire relationship. It's so important that he comes to New York with him. That's not even really discussed. So we have Z who is with him, who's so important and such a source of love, but also someone who has nursed this wound that is really foremost here. And also this idea that the healed femur stands for someone who survives. So my sense is that the healed foot, Z was the one who helped him heal it, and that will in fact allow him to survive. So that's against the suicide theory. So speaking of the femur and the healing, this is maybe a good moment to interject something else that I think is very persuasive in terms of my argument about my ending here, which is that when Sang is telling Cyrus about having met Roya and how their relationship sort of developed, While Cyrus is hearing this information, these black scabs start, appearing on the trees, and it's very ominous and upsetting. But what it reminded me of was the time when Sang and Roya first meet each other. The reason why Sang knows Roya is a painter is that she has a scab of paint on her neck. And so she peels off this scab of paint. So the idea of a scab of paint is enough of an image and, enough of sort of an arresting image that you then remember the idea of the scabs on the trees. These are the kinds of breadcrumbs that I'm sure are just everywhere throughout this novel. And if I go back to reread it, I will find many, many more of them, I'm certain. But this one did stand out for me. What's important here is the fact that this is the beginning of their love affair. This is the beginning of Sang and Roya, really communing together when the scab of paint is coming off. There's a type of healing too with scabs. Scabs mean that things are healing. In this case, the scab is even coming off. So we can also see a certain amount of healing that has happened with Roya. So Roya at this point is both falling in love with Sang, but also being birthed as an artist and as a painter. So this idea of the scab coming off and having, this sort of emerging as this visual artist and one who's going to become incredibly successful is really important. And ultimately, it allows her to have this kind of martyrous death in the museum. So the continuation of that, which is important at the end here, is that Cyrus's neck is very cold. His neck is, he keeps talking about how his throat is very cold and how his neck is very cold. And that idea of the neck, I think, is very important because, in fact, his mother has the scab on her neck. So this idea of feeling the cold there is very significant. He also talks at one point about the having in his throat this doomed, I can't remember exactly the words now, which is frustrating, but it's this sense of doomed survivor's guilt, that he has this survivor's guilt for not having been on the airplane. This is back when he thinks that Roya is dead. But this idea of the cold and of this pain in his throat that eventually is going to be healed in this last part by Z, he forgets about the cold. I mean, the idea of his throat as being very, very cold and his neck as being very cold, I think is meant to echo back to this love affair and this kind of birth of an artist that happens for Roya. I wish I had known how difficult the ending was going to be, because I would have read more carefully in terms of these small details. But there were enough that I happened to remember even after a first reading, that I think the neck thing and the scab and the coldness, all of that is very important. So, and then when we go down a little bit further here, we have Cyrus talking about how this all reminds him of a Milosz poem. And then a little further down, Z says this: "All those severe poets talking big about the wages of sin all the time," Z added, "but nobody ever brought up the wages of virtue. The toll of trying really, really hard to be good in a game that's totally rigged against goodness." So again, this is this idea of surviving. Z is eminently good. He's someone who just is good. Like throughout the entire book, he just is this good person. And Cyrus's ability to recognize that and also to recognize their connection allows us to see Cyrus as growing personally. And then down a little further, Z says, "Where does all our effort go?" And this is interesting because in this chunk, when Z is talking, his voice becomes unexpectedly high. And my interpretation with that is that this is, oddly, and this may be an interpretation for the suicide thing, but Z in some ways is a kind of stand-in for a nurturing mother. And his voice is getting a little high, and he starts talking about monsters. Part of me here thought of the concept of the art monster and how art monsters are often not women because all of the domestic expectations and all of the maternal expectations don't allow them to live only for their art. And when they do live only for their art, when they, cast aside any domestic and any maternal duties, they are really vilified. And women in that role are made to be like real monsters in a way that men who live only for their art are lionized. So we have this idea. Z's voice gets a little higher, and in some ways I felt like this was kind of a defense of Roya as someone who in fact did leave her son. It says this: "Where does all our effort go? It's hard not to envy the monsters when you see how good they have it, and how unbothered they are at being monsters." So, I mean, I think that's, my theory might be a bit of a stretch there, but I think there is a lot of anger that Cyrus is feeling toward his mother for having abandoned him. But I think we're having a lot of healing here with Z. So I think in some ways he does view his mother as somewhat monstrous. So then this is very important. Z says that line, and how unbothered they are at being monsters. That's like an art monster concept, but also monstrous people. And then the next line is Cyrus. That's why heaven and hell, right? Why people talk about that stuff. Nah, fuck hell, Z said, shaking his head. Hell's a prison. All we do is build those on Earth. No need to imagine more. So he's pushing away the idea of hell, which is a relief. Cyrus smiled. And fuck heaven, too, Z continued. Like, goodness is a place you can arrive at, a destination. So to me, this idea of like fuck hell and fuck heaven, you have this idea of like, we're not interested in the well, it could be just that you're not interested in those kind of organized religion conceptions of, like a good place and a bad place. But in my mind, it also helps us argue for the idea that they're not going to either heaven or hell. They're not going to another world. They're arriving at a place of happiness. And I am trying to argue that that place of happiness is in this park, and it's the two of them being reunited. Then a little bit further, the topography of the Brooklyn skyline, and somehow also Manhattan's, and several unfamiliar skylines too, was blistering all around them. Towering cracks now running up the side of skyscrapers, molten liquids roiling, smoking, pooling against the marble and steel and glass. Lava hardened into new land. We had that section during the Book of Martyrs, where he talks about being a volcano and not having erupted yet. And here we have all of this kind of volcanic stuff. We have the molten liquids roiling, we have the smoking, we have things cooling, and we have the idea of lava creating new land. So my interpretation of that is that this volcano has sort of diffused itself, that it is creating a space there for Z and for Cyrus that is built on top of his anger, but he's able to let the anger go because that volcano is creating these new spaces. And then the next line is excellent. Somebody's feeling frisky, Cyrus teased. Z pulled his head back, raised his eyebrows. So this idea of somebody's feeling frisky, I read that as some sort of like whatever they're looking at. And, you can argue that they're in heaven. You can argue that this is just, a poet's kind of vision of what it would be like when the two of them recognize, that they are happiness together. That's kind of the way I want to think about it. But this idea of somebody's feeling frisky, you could see that as some sort of God or Mother Nature as feeling frisky. You could also think of it as like a big capital G God, and that, this is some sort of version of death. See, that's how you know all of this is real, Z said, fanning out his hand to the city wilding around them. What do you mean? I mean, that's like the difference between real life and dreaming. Nobody's ironic in a dream. Nobody goes around winking and smirking. So this idea of this not being a dream, I think, is also this idea of this being real, for me, is arguing, in fact, that this is the two of them, and what they're experiencing is this externalized sense, like this externalized transformation of the space, because, in fact, it is sort of their love, and it is this happiness that they are finally arriving at. But this idea, too, of him saying it's real, it's not a dream. If he's saying it's real, it also is not heaven. Then down a little further, the ground was breathing, revealing tiny little golden fissures in the earth as it swelled. The trees dropped their flowers, then their branches to the ground, slowly, almost delicately, like new lovers undressing in front of each other for the first time. The sky had gone from white to gray to bright orange, a great cigarette sucked back to life. There was thunder but no rain, or maybe not thunder, but great cracking sounds all around. So you have this sense here of things being transformed, and you have this idea of this golden kind of light and this golden thing and the golden fissures, that this glow, this heat beneath them that I still want to associate with Layla and Roya is also happening for them, for the two of them. It won't be long now, said Z. Cyrus squeezed his hand again, took a deep breath. Why don't I feel startled by any of this? He asked. Shouldn't I be more scared? So this is, I think, an argument for the fact that maybe they're ascending into some sort of heaven. But I also think that you could argue that this idea of shouldn't I be scared, it's this idea of really committing to someone. It's the idea of really feeling happiness, like this idea of like putting aside the idea of suicide, which he has tried on a number of times, and really committing to living in a way. He's going to create the book of martyrs, .docx, and he's going to create his book called Martyr. But then in order to do that, he has to really accept this idea of happiness, of contentedness. And I think that we can believe, until this point, we have not seen Cyrus as an artist. So I think we are meant to believe that this kind of, at the end of the book, this kind of blossoming and this goldenness that he and Z are sinking into is also the birth of him as an artist. It's the birth of him as a writer and a poet. He says, why don't I feel startled by any of this? Shouldn't I be more scared? And then Z says, underneath being startled is the expectation of calm. A person gasps because the ease they were expecting was interrupted. I think probably your life hasn't taught you to expect ease. Jesus, Cyrus said, yeah. A lot of people mistake neglect for calm, cosmic neglect or otherwise. But nobody's neglected you, Cyrus. You see that now, don't you? I think I'm starting to, yeah, Cyrus answered. Then, where is all this coming from? And then a little down further, I've had a lot of time to think about it, Z answered, laughing. A long, long time. So that to me speaks to the fact that for 2015, for years and years, Z has been devoted to Cyrus and has really been thinking about what it will be that will convince him that in fact he has been cared for. I would argue that he has been neglected because his mother left him, but also that his basic needs have been met. Then they have this vision behind them on the park bench. Behind them, a great black stallion, twice the size of the rest, with an illuminated rider gripping the reins, dressed in a long black cloak. This is obviously Arash, who is the angel of death. Really? Said Cyrus. Z smiled, shrugged. You'll forgive the universe its moment of high drama. So what's important to me here is this is all happening behind them. So this is obviously the angel of death passing by, and I think the people who want to argue that he is dead can argue that the people who are dying are, seeing the angel of death, who is also his uncle. But in this case, because it is behind them and because they're speaking about it lightly, when he says, really, he's like, oh gosh, that's kind of a lot, to have this death passing by. And Z says, you'll forgive the universe its moment of high drama. It's almost as if Z is, able to sort of create all of this with his love, with his acceptance and his care for Cyrus. They sat for another moment watching the sky curl, churn like cream in coffee. They held hands, watching, thinking about blissfully little. Then Z said, you feel ready? I think so, said Cyrus. His foot was burning, a heat so hot it looped through, so hot it feels cold, and felt hot again, scorching. So again, I would think that in my mind, this is emblematic of the axe injury, which is, death and war and all this generational trauma. But it is also the fact that this is mended, which is the beginning of humanity. Cyrus looked down at his shoe, the foot that had been throbbing, and saw a swirling void, a cosmos of deep gravity and pale bones. He saw his family, both his parents, his book, his own face, futureless, like a shattered crystal ball. So I think you could argue here futureless is really arguing, I think people will read that as this idea of him not having a future because he in fact is not going to survive, that he is in fact dying at this point. But I predictably, am not reading it like that. So when he saw his family, both of his parents, his book, which is the book about being a martyr, all of these different martyrs, his own face, futureless like a shattered crystal ball. So what this says to me is he is in the moment, he is in his love, and he's not trying to figure out what it means. He said in the beginning, I want to stop figuring out what it means. I don't want to think about what my parents, my history. He doesn't want to think about any of that. And he is now being freed. So it's the crystal ball shattering because he doesn't have to worry about seeing the future anymore because he and Z are in this moment of blossoming and lava cooling and new land being formed. Okay, and then we have this beautiful final paragraph. Together, Cyrus and Z stood up. The golden light cracking through the ground had gathered into a vast and deep pool, warm and gurgling absently like an unattended infant. So I would argue there, this idea of the unattended infant and the gurgling and the happiness, they're going back to this kind of infantilized moment. Again, Cyrus is often infantilized when he is with Z. And so Z in many ways is sort of healing all of the trauma that not having a mother has, even them sharing the bed, in a non-sexual way. You have this sense of Z as nurturing him and not having neglected him. So the two of them are going back into this pool, which is maybe amniotic, and also maybe, another parallel to the lake where Arash and where Roya was really not afraid to dive in, and she was very bold about the whole thing. And in fact, Roya survived a death that was like sort of fated for her, whereas Arash, in fact, was undone by being the angel of death. Okay, the golden light cracking through the ground had gathered into a vast and deep pool, warm and gurgling absently like an unattended infant. Cyrus knelt over the swirl and gasped a little. He was, somewhere in the back of his mind, aware he was crying, that Z was there kneeling beside him, wiping the tears from his cheeks, kissing them. So again, I think we have this kind of rebirth, and we have this idea of Z as being both parental and also, in this case, sort of a midwife. It was almost unbearable, how good and warm it felt to be there, together, in the pond's golden light. The feeling of prayer, not prayer itself, but the stillness it leaves, lifted from the earth, smelling of grass and wood smoke. Cyrus reached his hand into the pool and closed his eyes. He felt another hand. Was it his own or Z's? Grab it. Around them, birds and bright blossoms dropped like fists of snow from the sky. So the ending here, I think, is purposefully ambiguous. I, again, am going to argue that this goldenness underneath is this lava that Cyrus was concerned about, this idea of anger, but it has been transformed by the fact that Z is with him and that Z has always cared for him, and that, in fact, the two of them are together, and they're standing together, and they are kneeling together, and all of this nurturing is happening on the part of Z for Cyrus. So here, when we have this idea of reaching in, it's this idea of reaching into this transformed anger, reaching below the surface. And we also should think of that surface, the humming and the heat underneath that surface, as being the love that Layla and Roya also experienced. So we have this idea of them accepting love together, and the idea of like reaching in and feeling the hand and not being sure if it's his hand or Z's hand. I think in many ways we can read Z as a kind of twin for him, like as a kind of the happier, more tended part of him, like the part of him that is going to allow him to sustain himself moving forward, and in fact has allowed him to be sustained ever since his father died. So you have this idea of this force and the idea of the two of them coming together. The very last sentence, birds and bright blossoms dropped like fists of snow from the sky. So the idea of blossoms falling and the idea of the birds falling is unnatural. So that's a problem for my theory. The idea of the blossoms falling from the sky, that sounds fine because it could be, like raining blossoms. But the idea of like fists of snow from the sky, so that also is a little ominous. And the snow at one point seems like it's not moving. It's kind of hanging there. And at other points, it is snowing faster than you ever think it could snow. So at the end, we have this kind of ambiguous thing of the fists of snow falling. And again, I think if I went back and read more carefully, I would be able to find some resonances for these final images. But the thing that was most salient for me is the idea of this golden pool and the idea of them reaching into it and the idea of them being together. All of that is to say that Kaveh Akbar has done this amazing thing, which has come up with an ending that I am reading as a happy ending, and I'm arguing is a happy ending, but one that also, if you really want to read it in a way that is saying that this is some sort of apotheosis, some sort of, going to heaven, some sort of end of life kind of thing, that you can also read that and argue it pretty persuasively. So I can't think of another example where an author has given us so much data that, yes, it's kind of conflicting, but is also just so incredibly convincing and so moving and so well done. I think the ending of the book, it's gotten a little bit of criticism, which I completely understand, because I think people sometimes are like, I just want to know one way or the other. I, in fact, when I finished the book, was like, oh my gosh, wait, this is not clear to me. So, not everybody's going to go back and do what I did. And hopefully what I have just told you is helpful in terms of answering some of those questions. And, if you wanted the happy ending, I hope that I convinced you that it was, in fact, a happy ending. And I hope that today has given you a better sense of how amazing this book is. So thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.